Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to our event in partnership with Abellio, entitled Missing the Bus, What is the Future of Our Bus Services? In particular, I think we're focusing on what needs to happen in the short term to ensure our bus services survive, and how the service needs to change in the long term in order for it to thrive. So it's the short term and the long term that we're interested in, and we've got a fantastic panel of speakers to explore those issues, and I'll come to them in a moment. As always, our event is being recorded and will be made available after the event on our website. For those new to Zoom, there can't be many now that fall into that bracket, but nevertheless, your recommendation is to go to Speaker View. That's the best experience for watching the event. And as I've already said, if you can keep your microphones on mute, unless I ask you to ask a question, that will be much appreciated. And the hashtag for the event is Missing the Bus. After the panel's contributions, which will last about 30 minutes or so, we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. If you have a question, you don't have to wait until the end. You can submit your question as we're going along and submit it to Ask a Question. You'll see that in the chat function. Ask a question, submit it, and we'll get to it at the appropriate time. And we'll be done and dusted by 12 o'clock. So that's how the event will run. Let's move on to our contributions. So our first speaker is Laura Shoaf. Laura is the Managing Director of Transport for West Midlands. Is going to focus on the challenges and opportunities for the buses, both in the short term and in the long term, from her part of the country. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to try to sort of set the scene a little bit from how it feels from the perspective of a transport authority, as in the short term and the medium term, and then I think where we need to get to in the long term, as Andrew said. So over the past 4 months, I think it's become abundantly clear that public transport is an absolutely essential public service. Certainly in the West Midlands, from the beginning of the crisis, it has played a critical role. We were able to keep our network safe and available, and that guaranteed the mobility of our essential workers, many of whom have no access to a car or any other mode of transport. And we know that for our economy and for the society to have a successful and a sustainable long-term recovery, that public transport will need to be an integral part of the plans of city regions. But COVID-19 is challenging the very survival of urban integrated transport systems. The business model of commercial providers has proven to be completely unsustainable, and the pandemic has absolutely decimated ridership. All indications are that people will return to public transport and to the network really slowly. So for us, probably the single biggest challenge is how are we going to restore trust in our network? Because providing public transport at the passenger levels that we are is completely unsustainable and uncommercial. The timing of this is absolutely critical. We as a nation are under a lot of pressure to restart the economy, to rebuild back, and certainly build back around cities and city center use. We're going to have to manage what will be the implications of Brexit, the challenges of getting schools restarted in just 6 weeks' time so that people and parents can get back to work, and that our students can get educated and that trained, and those who can possibly join the job market can. But all of this within the context that the network is going to have to be flexible in case of either a second wave or a local outbreak, as we've seen across the country. The long-term impact of COVID is still unknown, but I think what we know is that not all of society has been equally impacted by the pandemic. And what we saw, especially in the beginning stages of the lockdown, was that that network needed to be there for those who needed it most. And those were the people who don't have access to a car and who had essential jobs. And the same will need to be true after this. And so public transport has got to be part of the solution. Buses are what we call them the veins in the West Midlands. They do the lion's share of the work on our network, 270 million journeys a year on bus in the West Midlands. And we are really quite concerned that what is going to happen is that the market is going to shrink and that accessibility will be taken away from those people who need it the absolute most. So what are the biggest challenges that we face? I think it is about, especially with bus, how are we going to provide and how are we going to restore the trust with the customer, that they know that our network is safe, that our network is clean, that the network is reliable, that it remains affordable, and it's flexible, and it's legible for people to use. But that is what we need to do in order, I think, to restore people's trust ensure that they come back to using public transport and bus, which is such a critical part of public transport. So I'll stop there. There are quite a few speakers, and I'm be really interested in taking part of the panel conversation and the questions from colleagues on the call. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. And as you say, it's not just about how the system functions, but it's how people feel about the system and making sure that we can build and message that get confidence and trust back into the system for people to come back onto it. So fantastic. So let's move to get a business perspective. So our second speaker now is Clive Memmott. Clive is the Chief Executive of the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, and obviously he's going to give us that view as to why the importance of the bus system to the business community, not only in Greater Manchester, but more generally, and therefore what needs to be done. Clive, morning and over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Morning, everybody. I mean, back in November, Centre for Cities launched in Manchester their excellent report back then on bus franchising, and that was on the cusp of a piece of work by the National Infrastructure Commission at the time, which talks about the need to accelerate the amount of spending on getting people around inside the city regions as well as city-to-city connections. So these are remain pivotal things. COVID's changed a lot, but those things haven't changed. They've been magnified more by this crisis. And I think Simon Jeffrey's excellent report really made the point that, you know, buses are critical urban infrastructure. They're not the less glamorous relative of tram or train or cycling or walking. And we've got to remind ourselves that 75% of journeys on public transport in Greater Manchester are by bus, and that's despite the remarkable decline in bus usage outside London in the last 30 years. Now, our ambition in Greater Manchester, I'm sure, is like everybody else is on the call. It's to develop a modern, low-emission, accessible bus system, fully integrated within the wider transport network, in which everyone is happy to travel, regardless of background or their mobility level. Now, back then we started a 12-week consultation on whether or not to introduce franchising into Manchester. That closed back in January, and about 8,000 people took part in that, and about 71% of people actually expressed an opinion, of which 83%, 84% was positive and supported that proposal, and 8% didn't. And what's interesting, I mean, I'd always been relatively, probably before Simon's report, and I got to know it and talk about it a bit, I've been relatively ambivalent about franchising. I thought there was a danger that it was regarded as a sort of holy grail, the solution, and things like enhanced partnership arrangements could actually probably work as well. But I was changed by that report the more I thought about it, the more people I talked to, that if you don't actually fundamentally change that regulatory framework and look at what happened as a result of bus deregulation, nothing fundamentally will change. And I think, you know, what is there not to like about those major recommendations in that report, which basically said every metro mayor should take up their bus franchising powers in the the Bus Services Act. Deregulation absolutely failed to spark real competition. It's the fundamental institutional and financial rewiring accountability that really delivers the change that we need. It also said that, you know, what the downside of franchising is there are a lot of immediate upfront costs that have got to be borne, and government should bear some of those costs. And also government should encourage and allow cities to introduce franchising without application to the Secretary of State. So has COVID changed any of that? I mean, fundamentally, of course it hasn't. What it has done is it's put a completely different focus on that. And one of the big problems we've got at the moment is there's clear evidence that people's propensity to use public transport is actually even getting worse in the last few weeks. This will take a long time to address. But basically now public transport is absolutely uniquely supported by public funding, and that clearly magnifies the argument that it must better align with national and local priorities, and that surely that support from government is better directed through local transport authorities, like Transport for Manchester, like Transport for the West Midlands, than it is direct to the individual bus companies. A third of households in Greater Manchester have no access to cars. Bus helps. It's an incredibly democratic form of transport. It's fair, it's inclusive, it has huge environmental benefits. And this can be deployed quickly and instantly, and it hasn't got the same timescales as big infrastructure. So broadly speaking, a lot's changed, but fundamentally that requirement is still the same. But we've never needed efficient buses than we've needed them now. So we should move forward with this as even more ambitiously than we proposed previously. Thanks, Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Clive. And thank you very much for the very kind comments and references to the report, which you can read on our website. So we undoubtedly come back to that as we get into the conversation. So let's go to our third contributor, which is Alan Pilbeam. Alan is the Chief Operating Officer at Abellio, and obviously he's going to give us a perspective from the bus operator. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to flip this on its head and have a look at the long term first of all, and then short term. And if we stand back and look at this from 1,000 feet rather than down in the weeds, we are at a fork in the road. There's no going back to March, how things were. There will be a new normal, and I think that's abundantly clear. As we find a way out of this, the government needs to decide the route out. Is it an economic approach of austerity, or do we invest, take a Keynesian approach and try and turbocharge our economy? I think there's only one choice there, really. Indications from the government are an approach of investment and enabling us, or looking to build back better, to coin a phrase from Andy Burnham. I would rather we take that route. I'd rather we didn't take an austerity approach and a path to nowhere, because I just think we will fail. I've used the term and then end up dying in a ditch. I don't want to do that. So then I'd ask, do we have a choice for our economy to be underpinned by an integrated, spatially efficient, sustainable, low carbon, multimodal transport network, or do we underpin it by car? The answer to that is, of course, there is no choice if we want to build back better and turbocharge the economy. A car-based solution isn't viable for a number of reasons, but I will come on to it later. That's the messaging currently, to get in your car and to get off public transport. A car-based solution won't work for our geography and our population. It's spatially inefficient, will eliminate any benefits of agglomeration through increased congestion, and for the foreseeable, it will worsen emissions, we'll have lower air quality, and it will put a heavy load on the NHS due to continuing respiratory illnesses. And just noting what Clive said, it will perpetuate the social and structural inequality that we do have. But investment in buses, public transport, will aid the levelling up agenda. So I think that so far it's very straightforward of what the future should look like. So do we invest in public transport? I don't think we've got a choice. Do we invest in bus? We haven't got a choice. If we don't invest in bus now, whatever commercial model you're under, it will fail. Prime Minister already earlier in the year indicated a positive move, a £5 billion package for bus and cycle links, which I think set the right direction. The government's acted decisively during this crisis with public procurement notice, COVID bus services support grant, we've got furloughing, but it's piecemeal and it's a sticking plaster. We now need long-term certainty if we're really going to turbocharge our way out of this. And we need to be bold, though. There needs to be, for that funding going into bus, I personally think it needs to be simplified, directed to the local transport authorities, but there needs to be a quid pro quo. There needs to be reciprocity here. And we need to accelerate plans, base it on a low emission, future-proof solution, bus priority, to provide a world-class public transport solution that is truly integrated. Local authorities need to decide what route forward it is for the entire region. Is it hydrogen electric or is it electric? Distribution network operators need to come to the party and not come to the party with their hands held out for money, because the future would be rosy for them with a low carbon future. So if we do, I don't think we have a choice. I think it should then be, the quid pro quo should be adopting a franchising approach, especially in metro mayor cities, to create those controlled integrated transport networks that are spatially efficient and sustainable. And the employers will come, jobs will come, kids will be healthier, the NHS will have a lower workload, and we can pay for the mess that this virus has created. So in the short term, I think that's the long term. I think it's inevitable, and I think COVID has shone a light on what's urgently needed. But the messaging now needs to change. The messaging, there's been a lot of work done by everyone to make public transport safer. We've learnt as we've gone along, and we need clear messaging for a path to reduce and then eliminate social distancing. And then I think it's up to business leaders from all walks of life to show leadership now and to get people back to work. There will be increased flexible working, but we do need to also get people going back to the offices as well, so that our city centres can start up again, and we can get back to as close to normal in the new normal as possible. Thank you, Andrew.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Alan. So let's go to our final contributor, and we're already getting some questions in. So if questions are occurring to you as you're listening to our panelists, please submit them, and we'll come to them shortly. Our final speaker is Baroness Vere of Norbiton, who's an Under Secretary of State for the Department of Transport and has a particular focus on buses. So, Minister, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks very much to Laura and Clive and to Alan for setting the scene. And so I'd just like to sort of say a few words from the government perspective. So I am indeed Buses Minister, and it's taken up an extraordinary amount of my time over recent months, and absolutely rightly so. I think I remember 6 months ago, I was at a bus industry dinner and I stood up and I made a speech and I said, 2020 is going to be the year of the bus. I'm not entirely sure this is quite what we had in mind. And then I think some of you will also remember there was a bus summit, which is a great event at the QE2 Centre in Westminster, and it was back on the 6th of February. And then it was splashed all over the national news and in the newspapers in the subsequent days for all the wrong reasons, not because the buses were so brilliant, but that someone there had coronavirus, and I was sent letters from Public Health England, and we didn't know what we're going to do, we're going to have to go into quarantine. But that seems like a very, very long time ago, and so much has happened since then. Of course, this has been an extraordinary period. It's had a profound effect on our economy. Buses have been absolutely no exception. And, you know, we have moved from earlier this year thinking about how we were going to boost numbers on buses, our bus strategy, all those brilliant plans that we had in place. And we had to go to telling people not to use buses. And as a public transport minister, that's a very, very hard message to get out there. But it was, you know, really, really necessary. And so changes have been really quite dramatic, and social distancing is in place and will continue to be in place for a while. Now we have hand gel, we have face coverings, we have enforcement of face coverings. So we are really in a very different place. But, you know, the last few months have been extraordinary. My workload and my work rate has had to go up exponentially. I'm fairly sure yours has too. And I think one of the few positives that has come out of the pandemic is the amount of engagement that has happened across the industry and between all of the stakeholders who are involved in the industry. We've been sharing information, we've been trying to reach the right decisions as quickly as we possibly can. So, you know, just my thanks to everybody who's been part of our journey so far, and I very much appreciate your support as we move on. And of course, our thanks must also go to all the people at the front line who have kept our services running in the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances. You know, we've had drivers out there getting our critical workers to work. They've shown immense determination, loyalty, and often, you know, immense bravery. So we are certainly very appreciative of everything that they've done. So we're in a sort of a slightly new situation now. Obviously, we've seen places like Leicester where we cannot be complacent. From a government perspective, obviously, we're hoping that track and trace and local lockdown will be part of the future if necessary, rather than going back to anything which looks like a national lockdown. So we just need to make sure that we can capture flare-ups as and when they happen and take the appropriate action. So I think there might be a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So, thinking back to where we started back in March, obviously we had to lock down pretty quickly and ridership plummeted. And so what we did as a government, and I hope, I think we got on the case pretty quickly with this, with our first round of funding, which supported 50% of services just to keep, if not buses in rude health, but certainly, at least on life support whilst we maintained those services. And that was really, really important. And then as lockdown began to lift, we recognised as well that, we weren't and still aren't sure what future demand is going to look like and when it's going to kick in. But certainly from us, we wanted buses back to as much 100% as we possibly could, which is what the reasoning behind the second round of funding was, just to make sure that people have confidence that actually the services are back and they're operating. And of course, what we're doing now is we're looking at what the next round of funding looks like. And certainly part of our considerations for that is, what does the exit plan look like? What would have to be the case for government to be able to say, okay, buses are back, we're back in a sort of steady state situation, so therefore we can then look on to the future from there. I think, like you, I'm particularly concerned about September. I think a lot of businesses have written off the summer and said, all right, you know what, go away if you can, and let's start again in September. So we're going to have a double whammy in September. We're going to have businesses coming back, I think, in much greater numbers than we've seen before. And of course, we've got the school children. So we do have a plan for the school children, which we're trying to put in place at pace. It's not easy because we're having to do it quickly. And of course, schools are now not there, but we're trying to think about how we can get the school children back and how that we make sure the buses are available for working age adults who also will. It would be absolutely essential that we get them to work. But as Laura said, and as many other people I'm sure will recognise, public confidence in buses is not high at the moment. I think we can keep boosting their confidence. So over time, we can encourage people back onto buses. We have changed our messaging. You would have seen that last week. It's going to be much more over the course of the summer about travelling safely. We need people to wear their face coverings, be respectful, be responsible, and then we'll get as many people back on buses as possible. So I think together we've made some really good progress, and the operators have been great. The work that they've done in terms of launching new features on apps and things, showing how crowded buses are, and it's been a pleasure to work with the Metro Mayors and people like that in terms of thinking about what it looks like on the ground for them, for their sort of areas. And we can talk about the future, and it's absolutely critical that we don't lose sight of all the things that we had in plan to start with. So we are still, looking at the better deal for bus users, things that we pointed out there. So we've got the all-electric bus town where we had actually more bids than we had hoped. So it shows to us that there is still a great ambition out there to decarbonise bus fleets across the country. We will also be looking at the national bus strategy that is still in our plan, and that will be obviously focusing on getting lost services back again and also making bus travel more accessible and greener. We will be continuing with our plan to put 4,000 zero emissions buses back on the road, so you'll hear more about that later on this year. So in terms of the timing of what's going to happen, there'll be final sort of what we think hopefully will be a final round of bus funding with some sort of exit plan. Then we'll be looking as we head towards the spending review in the autumn. Hopefully we'll be able to tie in our 4,000 zero emission buses within that spending review. And then also in parallel to that, we'll be looking at the national bus strategy, which of course will cover all sorts of different things for buses and how we can make them better for customers. So, I'm also very conscious in all of this, as I'm sure you are, is that our bus manufacturers have been particularly hit by the coronavirus. So we're working with BEIS and obviously thinking about how we can make sure that we still have a bus manufacturing industry when we come out of the other end of this. So I think a number of people have mentioned what the services and the structure of services will look like going forward in terms of franchising. We do expect that there will be some changes over time. Clive spoke about this from a Manchester perspective, and it is clear that some local authorities are really keen to take a greater role in providing bus services. And from our perspective, we are very, very happy to work with people to talk about how franchising might work. I do think, though, we must bear in mind that for every Manchester where there is the capacity and the capability to operate a really good franchise model, there will be dozens of places who can't. And so what we've got to do is make sure we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution, and we put bus services at risk in places where, quite frankly, they're not up to the job, and they shouldn't be up to the job. So we just need to make sure that stays the same. So that's pretty much all from me. Thank you all for everything that you've done. I hope you'll appreciate the government has done its absolute best to continue with bus services. We absolutely support the sector, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. 4 great presentations, some issues in common, drawing out some themes, and we've had a bunch of questions as a result of that. Keep them coming in, and we'll get through them. We've got about 30 minutes or so for questions. There were a whole bunch of questions picking up really on where Laura started us off, which is about messaging and communication, almost before we think about actually the nature of the service that's been provided. So if John, if you're on the call still, can you get ready to unmute your microphone and ask your question in relation to messaging, and then I'll get my panel to respond. So John, if you're there, unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much for some interesting presentations. The question I have for the panel is that we have really put, I think, the general public in the situation where they think that public transport is in some way unsafe, whereas the message really was leave it free because it's restricted capacity, leave it free for the key workers. Now, throughout the whole of the pandemic, car manufacturers have been promoting through television, newspapers, other media, their products. One of my views is that the biggest job we've got to do before we even really begin the process of rebuilding the market, the biggest job we've got to do is to reassure the public that buses are safe, trains are safe. Please come back and use them, because we cannot afford to let air quality in our town centres, city centres, fall to the poor levels it was at before. So, as the Minister has said, it's vitally important that we do get back onto the road to zero as well. Okay. So my question is, should there be a national advertising campaign for public transport? Okay, so should there be well, that's an interesting one. So should there be a campaign for advocating the benefits of and the rebuilding trust in in public transport? Minister, I'm going to come to you first, because John did say national, but I'd be interested in then reflections from colleagues, particularly from Alan's point of view, but also Laura and Clive, who take a slightly different perspective. But Minister, your reflection on a campaign to build trust and awareness again?
Yeah, John's absolutely right, and I think from a messaging perspective, as we move forward, I think it's really, really important that we're consistent as well, because I think if the messages are confused out there, people don't quite know whether they're supposed to be travelling or not. So we have got a national campaign which has already started, and it's a £10 million campaign over the summer, which is about enjoying summer safely, and public transport will be an absolute key part of that, because we do want people to use public transport when they're out and about, getting back to museums, getting back to pubs and restaurants, maybe by the beach or whatever. So that has already got underway. And he'll probably recall that actually when we announced the National Bus Strategy, one of the parts of the things that we committed to do in that was a campaign specifically for bus and working with the bus industry to get people to think about bus more often, as opposed to, for example, taking their car. So there is work in progress. I completely recognise that it's going to be, we've got a big job ahead of us, but we're absolutely ready to do that.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. Alan, let me come to you next. Think about, national campaign as well as, or instead of, or in addition to, more localized stuff as well. But what's your kind of core points or key points around messaging and how we get that across to the public?
I think the first point is it doesn't take very, very long for people to change their habits. So I think there's already been damage done that is going to take a lot of undoing from people being encouraged to cars, quite understandably, at the beginning of this crisis. As I said before, messaging needs to change. Yes, I'd advocate and I support what the Minister said regarding the campaign for the summer. It then needs to grow some legs after that for September, when things are definitely going to be difficult in terms of the volumes going back to work, the school children, and I totally agree with the concerns there. And again, I think the messaging also needs to change around all the work that has been done, it being safe to use public transport and to encourage people to use public transport. But the other point I'd also make, hand in glove with this, should go this long-term plan around funding, and there needs to be a reciprocal arrangement whereby tough decisions are made locally for the longer term to discourage car usage, whether it's workplace parking, OV, road use, pricing, congestion charging. That needs to be the long-term plan that we're setting out, so that we can have a long-term plan for encouraging bus usage as part of an integrated transport network. But certainly short-term messaging needs to change rapidly, national campaign, local campaigns, and let's get people back on buses.
Brilliant. Okay, Laura, pick up this point and give us a sense as to what the West Mids are doing in terms of that messaging and that communication to the public about reusing the transport system, obviously buses.
Yeah, so first of all, I completely and totally agree. I mean, there should be a national campaign, regional campaigns, local campaigns. I go out once a week on our network, and but before I went out the first time, I was actually quite nervous myself, which is almost unbelievable given my job. But people need to take a first step in order to realize that it is clean, it is safe, it is absolutely fine to use, and so we need to push. So those are the messages that we need to send out. We're trying to do it locally, but we want to stay in step with what's been said nationally. So the change of message last week is really useful, but a really big campaign that shows people how safe it is to use the network would be great. We did a survey in the West Midlands probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago now. We got about 7,000 people responding. And when they were asked what they wanted to see as a positive legacy out of COVID, the responses were cleaner air, quieter roads, and a better work-life balance. I mean, by far and away, those were the trends that came out loud and clear. And I think reminding people that if that's the legacy they want to see, they need to think twice before they choose their car over public transport. Could be a very, very welcome message. Like we've said, a clean green recovery seems to be where we all want to be. You can't have that without people using public transport. So the messaging has to be better, it has to be more clear, and it has to be more of a pushback towards using it because it is safe.
Fantastic. Clive, what's the role of business? Is the Chamber active in this sort of space in, working with your members to encourage them to not necessarily jump in their car, even if it's for understandable reasons? I mean, what's the role of the Chamber in Greater Manchester and then more generally?
Well, it's the role of it's the general discussion. And let me say, I'm less sanguine than my colleagues on the benefits of a national campaign, because I think what we've got to accept here is that to transition quickly from don't use to use and think that that's delivered by a campaign it is a tough one. It takes time. I think this is absolutely more about the consistency of messaging, and I'm not saying that's easy, it's incredibly difficult, but what we have to do is get absolute consistent gradual messaging that changes that. I mean, the survey that you've just heard about in West Midlands, we did a similar one, I think with an even higher sample, but what absolutely jumps out of that is propensity to use, and they are at really, really, really low and worrying figures at the moment. So I think the other thing is that let's be clear that we're talking here, when we talk about a safe workplace, you're actually talking about the amalgam of three things. You're talking about the journey to and from work, you're talking about the workplace itself, and then you're talking about the public realm of which the workplace exists as part of. And you have to deal with all of that at the same time. Otherwise, people will not go back in the numbers we want. I think that ultimately, though, we have got to be ambitious towards. I can't see why we can't accelerate pedestrianisation schemes wholly beyond the scope of what they're seeing at the moment. I don't see why we can't accelerate greater use of bus lanes in the foreseeable future. There are things that we can do now that will facilitate use and ease of using public transport. But Andrew, make no mistake about it, this will take time. When you put out this amount of consistency, don't use messaging. You don't suddenly turn the tap on overnight.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. We've had a related question in terms of how you might incentivize people to travel. Paul Wheeler. Paul, if you're on the call, can you still on the event? Can you unmute and ask your question about incentives?
Yes, thank you. I say there's been talk there about advertising campaigns.
Yeah.
But my question is, does the government need to provide financial incentives to encourage people back onto using public transport?
Very good. So free travel for all. That's my words, not Paul's, obviously. Is that one of the things that we obviously did it to a degree in the very early stages in terms of people getting onto buses and not paying? Is that part of a strategy? What would that do for the industry? Minister?
Look, it's a great suggestion. I'm not entirely sure that the government is going to be paying for people's bus fares over and above the concessions, obviously, that we already provide.
Yeah.
But it is really, really important that we get people back onto bus. And I also would just like to pick up the point about accelerating cycling and walking and making more use of pedestrian areas. That's exactly what we want to see. We don't want to see it at the expense of bus priority lanes, and there have been some local authorities that have taken those out, which is really naughty, and that is not what's intended. But I think the point is that all of these things are locally delivered. And so it must be up to the local community to decide. And we're already seeing there's a huge amount of tension between those who would like to continue to use their cars and see their roads really, really sort of blocked up and congested, to those who recognise that actually just because you pedestrianise an area does not mean the death of the high street. It can absolutely help and support the high street. And I think that's a really key message that we need to get out there.
Very good. Excellent. Alan, I'll come to you on that question about, free travel. Is that part of the mix to get people on it as well as more proactive and engaging messaging? Would you welcome that as a bus operator?
I'm personally not really. You had free travel for an extended period in London, where we had centre door boarding. I actually think the key to this is two things. First of all, I agree with Clive. Consistent messaging, a clear path out of this towards a fully operational integrated network. And then the next thing I would say, which is a longer term view, if you really want people to use public transport, then give them a world-class public transport system. No halfway house, give them something that they choose to use, not that they're forced to use, and they will use it. So I go back to what I said right at the very beginning. If our economy is really going to be kick-started and have a long-term plan to actually pay for all of this mess, then I believe the only way forward is a world-class public transport system. That is with an integrated, spatially efficient network. We should seize on what has happened. There are some positives, walking, cycling as part of that, but also to lower emissions. So let's really accelerate future-proofing. We've got a younger generation coming through, far more the climate, less propensity to use cars. So I think it's two things. Let's get our messaging consistent. Let's have a milestone plan as we come out of this. But then let's be ambitious. Let's be bold and actually give them a world-class public transport system, and then we can take those harder decisions.
Okay, very good. That perfectly sets up the sort of next bunch of questions and the issue I want to explore, which is, how do you run that that system? What does it look like? Clive talked about franchising. Minister talked about there are different ways of doing things. There isn't one option necessarily, and obviously, Laura has kind of views on these as well. So, Ellie Harrison, Ellie, are you in? If you're still on the event, can you unmute your microphone and ask your question, if you don't mind?
Thank you. Hi everyone, and thanks for the presentation so far. It's been a really interesting event. I'm Ellie Harrison. I'm a volunteer with the Get Glasgow Moving campaign for a world-class, fully integrated and accessible public transport network for everyone in our region. So I do agree with Alan on that, but one thing I probably don't agree with Alan on is that from a passenger perspective, privatised public transport has never worked. For the last few decades, we've had millions of miles of routes cut, and fares are now just far too expensive and are still not integrated with other modes of transport. So we believe that only direct public ownership gives us the flexibility and control that we need now, and would be a much more efficient use of public money. And we have the powers to do this in Scotland now as a result of the Transport Act 2019. Do the panel think that these powers should be utilised in cities like Glasgow, Aberdeen, elsewhere, especially seeing First Group, who run the majority of our buses, are now in a huge financial crisis?
Right, excellent. So everybody's in agreement that we need a fantastic world-class bus system that's fully integrated into all other aspects of the transport system. So we can take that as a given. The question then becomes, how does one get there and how does one organise it? Alan, hold on for a second. I'm going to come to you in a moment. Laura, you kick us off. So Ellie's question was, public ownership is the only way to do this, or the best way to do this. Your responses to that, and then I'll draw in our other panel members as well. Laura, over to you.
Sure. So I'm not sure that I have necessarily an answer to that. I definitely agree that what we have now is not working. It's not working as well as it needs. I tend to try to be agnostic about the sort of who runs it. It's the outcomes that you want. So I agree with you. Obviously, best value for the taxpayer is definitely one. Does that need to be a deregulated approach? Possibly. What we can't have is planning modally. So we need the integration has been mentioned about 25 times on this call, more than I've ever heard. But I think it's safe to say that we're not going to get buses back the way they were pre-COVID anytime soon. So something needs to change quite quickly. If you handed me tomorrow full control and all of the buses and the trams and the trains in my region, I have to say I'm not quite ready and set up yet to take over all of those functions. But we are ready and willing to start to think about how we can channel funding through transport authorities so we can procure the best services for our region. And I think that's a sort of a stepping stone on the way to where you are. It takes quite a lot of time to sort of change networks and to change ownership and to change model and to make sure we can do that in a way that never forgets that what we're trying to do is provide a service to the passenger. So for me, it's about that. It's about the clean network. It's about the legible network. It's about the affordable network. It's about reliability as well. And for us, that's about being data led. And I do think that's one area where through public transport authorities like ours, we have the collective view and the data to understand how best to organize that network. Then again, how it delivers, I guess, I don't quite have that full answer for you yet.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed, Laura. And obviously, if the West Mids are, thinking about capacity and organisational challenges, then many of our smaller places will be, even more challenged from a capacity and organisational perspective. I am coming to you in a second, Alan. Clive, give us your view. You started by saying you were a convert to franchising, having kind of thought about this in more. Would you go the full hog and go to public ownership, or is franchising where you'd like to land?
I think franchising is a good starting point. but you can't do that everywhere else as well. And it is about blending different solutions for different areas. But look, if you want to have more routes, centralise your timetables, your tickets, and centralise standards, and make sure that where you live doesn't determine your access to a high value, clean, mass transit system, I'm afraid that franchising is very much, in my opinion, the absolute sensible starting point. Now, if that leads to something greater and full public ownership downstream, we'll see. But, let's also remember that different areas need different solutions, delivered in different ways.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Clive. Alan, you operate in different systems. What's your take on the pros and cons of the models that we've got, but also a big shift towards public ownership?
Yeah. So answering the question, I'm not a supporter of the deregulated market. For me, the commercial market has not worked. There are some islands of success, but overall, we're seeing a continuing decline generally in bus usage. There's no real competition in the market. I think through franchising, regulation, you can create that competition, and with competition, you get innovation. I would respond directly on the public ownership point that during the last 20, 30 years, you will have seen a lot of municipal companies failing, left, right, and centre. Vast majority. There are some left, but the vast majority have failed. And I think competition is important to drive innovation. So my point is, I do believe you need regulation, certainty around what integrated transport network you are going to plan, but there also needs to be that quid pro quo. It's not just about painting all the buses the same colour. It's not just all about integrated ticketing. It is around those bold choices to make sure you set up your city or town for public transport, and you prioritise it over the car. So I'm a fervent supporter of that approach. I believe that will lead to a better economy, a healthier economy, healthier kids, and I think it's the only way through this.
Excellent. Okay. Minister, as a minister of a Conservative government, are you in favour of public ownership of a quote-unquote public utility?
Well, I'm the buses minister for England, so I'm certainly not going to tell Scotland what to do, because I would get into deep trouble.
Wise.
But if Scotland wants to go ahead and run bus services, then it's it certainly can, and we will watch with interest. But I'd go back to, I think, what most of the people are focusing on, and that is outcomes. It's about outcomes for the passenger and making sure that we recognise how we can deliver those outcomes. And one of the things that I always find, always comes front of mind to me is things like rural bus services. We talk about, and obviously we've talked a lot today because we are talking about cities, and they're great economic hubs, and they're absolutely fantastic, and we can provide, really quite frequent and high quality services there. But what worries me is, how do I get the socially isolated people in small villages in the middle of nowhere? How do I get them into work effectively, or to see the doctor or whatever? So we've got to recognise that the whole sort of landscape is very, very different in different areas, and that's why different things might work in different places. But I think one of the things I'm particularly pleased that came out of the Bus Services Act was the open data work that we did, which we've now kicked off. Because I think, I live in southwest London. The 57 goes past my door. I know when it's coming. I walk out of my door 1 minute before it arrives, because I know it's about to arrive. It's extraordinary that that is not the case throughout the entire country. And I think the work that we've done on open data will benefit everybody, so that they too don't have to stand and wait for a bus. They know it's coming and they can see it's coming. I think that's hugely positive.
Thank you very much indeed. I just want to pick up on this final bit, particularly because it's been talked a little bit by Alan in some of his early comments, and indeed the minister did something similar in terms of, it's not just about prioritising the bus, but it's actually encouraging modal shift and thinking about how you do that by making cars more difficult. So Roger French. Roger, are you on the call? If you are, can you ask your question about the importance of modal shift or otherwise?
Yes, thanks very much. I was interested in the recent decarbonisation report that the DfT brought out just at the beginning of March. I'm very impressed to see that modal shift from public transport and from car to public transport, cycling and walking is regarded as the government's #1 priority. And I wondered if the Minister was totally committed to that, because the Secretary of State at the recent Select Committee was less sanguine. When asked about it and whether there would be any targets for modal shift, he replied along the lines that it was important to encourage motorists to switch to electric cars rather than less cars. And
Okay.
I do wonder, are the government really committed to less cars in decarbonisation, or is it all a case of switch to electric? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dee Rogers. I want us to try and stay on this, on the modal shift element of Roger's question, and particularly, yes, we can improve and amplify the offer on the public sector side, but I'm interested in the panel's thoughts about, is it now or is it when do we make the car slightly more difficult to use, particularly in our fairly dense urban areas that we're currently talking about today? Let's go to you first, Clive. You give me your view on this. Obviously, Greater Manchester has been there before on some of these things, undoubtedly will be there again, and then I'll get the rest of the panel.
Let's use the excellent example that the MD of Heathrow Airport said. You know, look, aircrafts aren't the enemy. You know, it's carbon that's the enemy. You don't set out to say, you know, cars are wrong. You just say it's much easier to use public transport if you want to get into a city centre, in my case. And I think you've got to, the repurposing of our cities in the light and the aftermath of this awful pandemic allows us to accelerate this considerably. You know, you are seeing whole-scale pedestrianisation of quite large zones. You know, let's be really ambitious and let's give priority. Let's give priority to those buses. It's great. Let's talk about cycling, but let's not exclude the buses as well. Get people into those city centres and make it easier. Government also incentivises big capital spends all the time. You know, it wants to build things. You know, buses are just as important as that. So let's make sure that we're completely even-handed in our approach to this. But the truth is, Andrew, don't disincentivise the car. Just make the public transport offer better.
Very good. Let's go to you, Laura. You know, sort of West Mids has talked around pricing, road congestion, and these sorts of issues. Does that need to be part of the mix? When that will be part of the mix?
I think you have to have the policy initiatives that drive the change that you want to see. So whether that's an overall reduction in the number of car parking spaces that are available in city centre, whether there's some sort of a clean air zone around it, as we've seen in a number of cities, and that changes behavior. But ultimately, it's about capacity. So there's only so much capacity on our roads and on our network, and we always need to be thinking about what is the highest and best use of that capacity. And you know, public transport, mass transit is, you know, as I always called it, being American, is how we move the bulk of people. It's how you get the most capacity out of the network that you have. But equally, how do we change short journeys? So the investment in walking and cycling, the trialing of e-scooters, e-bikes, and whether or not we'll see a bit of a revolution in the way that those are used, and changing those short journeys is all part of the mix. So we need to continuously innovate. But to me, what we're looking at, in the West Midlands, what we look at is what is the capacity that we have? How do we, maybe one of the outcomes of this will be spreading the peak or changing the peak. That gives us more capacity throughout the day. And then how do we use that for the highest and best use? And of course, the air that we breathe goes at the very top of that list in terms of the highest and best, one of the highest and best uses, and how we keep our citizens safe and healthy. And that's a combination of decarbonization and promoting active travel.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Dee. Alan, I mean, you talked a little bit about this earlier on, you know, sense of, you know, looking at both sides of the equation. Just outline your thoughts. How far would you go? What would you expect? What would you want to see?
So I think Roger's spot on. I agree with what Laura said. I've said cars are spatially inefficient, whether they're electric or they're diesel, they're spatially inefficient. So there is a finite capacity we have on our networks. However, it's a case of carrot and stick. So therefore, I'll give them a world-class integrated public transport network first for them to use, and then you need to use the stick. There needs to be workplace parking levies. There needs to be road user charging, low emission zones, and but now is when we need to do this. We have to have a coherent plan. The government needs to invest in public transport with devolution, and but there needs to be a commitment from those devolved areas to take those hard decisions and to supply the detail of a joined up plan that will get us to world-class public transport networks that people are happy to use, choose to use, and also the car is there are disincentives for the use of car. And just one point, I personally think there are solutions not just for the cities down the franchising route and this route. I do think we need to look at areas, joining up areas and giving them help maybe from government with some of the work around this to enable them to adopt similar integrated transport networks. And this should include demand response transport being integrated into your bus networks as well. But it's a case of carrot and stick. But I think Roger is spot on with his question. You do need a plan that's part of an overall plan that will get people out of cars.
Excellent. Okay. And final thoughts from you, Minister? Some sticks as well as some carrots?
Always need carrots, always need sticks. And I think that we also need to be quite clear about what government can and cannot do in this particular space. So we can provide the investment as we do, for example, demand responsive transport. We're looking at putting £20 million into that to try and see if we can make it work. So that's really important. So you've got the investment, you've got overarching regulation that we put in place, and then the sort of the general drive and the messaging. But really the way that we're going to change our cities in particular will be cohesive and locally led plans, because local areas already have quite a lot of powers, under sort of road space allocation. They can set speed limits, they can set charging, they have responsibility for their parking charges. So we need local authorities, local transport authorities, to sort of take responsibility and sort out and think about how they can make their system more integrated and with the appropriate modes of transport coming to the fore.
Fantastic. On that note, we could go on. We've had loads and fantastic questions, but unfortunately it's 12 o'clock, so we need to bring it to a close. My thanks to Abellio for partnering with us for this, but also for our work more generally on the future of the bus system in the UK. Obviously, my thanks to our brilliant speakers, Laura Shoaf, Clive Memmott, Alan Pilbeam, and Baroness Vere. Thank you very much indeed, all four of you, for contributing. Thanks everyone for participating. Those that posted questions, those that asked questions, thank you very much indeed. There is much more to be done and to be thought about in this sort of place in terms of making our buses not only fit for the near term, but making sure that they are a vital part of the country and the economy going forward. So as always, until the next time, stay safe and go well. Thank you very much indeed. Bye for now.
Thanks very much. Thank you.